Catherine Bell, Editor-in-Chief of Quartz, and I'd like to welcome all of you here today. The speed with which scientists around the world have developed multiple highly effective COVID-19 vaccines has been absolutely astonishing. And in some hard-hit places like here in New York, things are looking up. But the recovery, like the impact of the pandemic itself, is already extremely unequal. About 86% of the shots administered so far have been given in high and upper middle income countries. And according to a new report from the Rockefeller Foundation, vaccinating 70% of the population of all lower and middle income countries in the world by the end of next year, 2022, would cost an estimated $44 billion US. Figuring out how to pay for this and how to make it happen is a moral imperative for the wealthiest countries in the world. It's also necessary from a public health perspective. No country is safe until the pandemic is under control everywhere. And it's a smart economic investment, as many reports have already shown. Today, we're going to talk about what else needs to happen in order to keep everything, in order to bring the pandemic under control and ensure that everybody around the world has equitable access to vaccines and also to other essential medicines, and make sure that the distribution is equitable, not just between countries, but within countries as well. How can we seize this opportunity to right longstanding injustices, to solve what have seemed to be intractable problems in our public health systems around the world, and to make healthcare everywhere more accessible, affordable, and equitable? I recognize that this is a lot to talk about, so we'll be talking about in just 1 hour, and I wish we could keep our panel here all day. But so we're going to do our best, get through as much as we can, and we're going to be talking about the big picture, the context, and also some really specific projects and experiences that our panelists have had in their organizations. So we have an amazing panel, and I will introduce them in just a moment. But first, we have a few small housekeeping details. We'll be recording today's conversation. It'll be available tomorrow at qz.com, and you'll get an email about it as well. So if you find this conversation useful, please share it. At the bottom of your screen, I presume you've all been using Zoom probably too much already and know this already, but at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat button, and please feel free to jump in and chat with your fellow audience members during the event. This is something that I prefer about digital events, that you can do that and not disturb the peace of the event, but add to it. There's also a Q&A button next to that, and that's where, if you have questions, please share them. Our panelists will be ready to answer them toward the end of the discussion. So that's the place to ask a question. If you need closed captioning, there's a button at the bottom that says live transcript with a little CC, and you can click on that and get closed captions. So let's meet our panelists. First, we have Dr. Jono Quick, who is Managing Director for Pandemic Response, Preparedness, and Prevention at the Rockefeller Foundation, and Adjunct Professor of Global Health at Duke University's Global Health Institute. He has served as President and Chief Executive Officer of the global health nonprofit Management Sciences for Health and Director of Essential Medicines at the World Health Organization. He's also the author of The End of Epidemics, The Looming Threat to Humanity and How to Stop It, which was published with excellent timing in 2018. Next, we have Dr. Joya Mukherjee, who is Chief Medical Officer at Partners in Health, which is a nonprofit organization in Boston, which brings high quality, comprehensive healthcare to poor communities around the world in partnership with local governments. She's also an associate professor in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School, and an associate professor in the Division of Global Health Equity at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. She's also written a textbook, which is relevant to our conversation today, An Introduction to Global Health Delivery, Practice, Equity, and Human Rights. And finally, we have Dr. Eric Edwards, who is co-founder and CEO of Flow with a PH, the only pharmaceutical company that is also a public benefit corporation, or B Corp. Flow uses advanced manufacturing techniques to produce essential medicines that are in short supply in the United States. and he's previously co-founded and held several executive positions at Kaleo, another pharmaceutical company, and he's an inventor and also a paramedic. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being with us today. So Jono, I'd love to start with you. I know that you were deeply involved in the global response to HIV and AIDS throughout that period. Can you talk about the global response to these two pandemics, how they differ, and what your assessment is about where we are right now in comparison to where we were at this stage in the AIDS pandemic? And also a bit about what we've learned from the global fight against AIDS and how that has affected how things have gone in the last year.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. That's quite a list. So to put in perspective, AIDS was the first new human pandemic in modern times. And it, much like a coronavirus in a sense, but different in key ways, it got off really slowly because there was this long asymptomatic period that let it get, the analogy I use is when you get a fire in the roots of a forest and it sort of spreads slowly through the forest and you start seeing some smoke in different places, and then all of a sudden the whole forest is on fire. And that's what the AIDS pandemic was like. It really started taking off around the globe. And the stunning thing was that the first case was identified in 1980. It actually started the animal to human species jump that started it was in the 1920s. That gives you a sense of how long it took. But it took 17 years before we had highly effective antiretroviral therapy, and it was a game changer. While by the year 2000, we had emptied the hospitals in Europe and North America of AIDS patients with good treatment. It was still a death sentence in Africa. And even though we had treatment in the North, if you had asked most people in the public health community in the year 2000, at the turn of the millennium, if you had described what actually existed in the year 2010 in terms of prevention, treatment, large-scale programs, they would have said, and I remember the conversation, not in the world I know, impossible. Well, people imagined the impossible and they made it happen. They crashed the barrier of no drugs, they crashed the barrier of sky-high prices, they crashed the barrier of no money, and they crashed the barrier of no systems. And Joya knows that the Partners in Health is a classic barrier crasher organization. So fast forward to coronavirus. It has all gone much, much faster. The first really true global devastating pandemic of the 21st century. It's gone faster, but one of the things it's shared is this high degree of asymptomatic spread, slow spread. So it's really gotten to so many different places. What has been stunningly different, whereas AIDS were 40 years, what do we had, 40 plus years on, we don't have a vaccine. With coronavirus, we have a historic, as you alluded to, group of vaccines, which has been just mind-boggling. And again, if 14 months ago you'd gotten a dozen virologists and said, can you imagine 14 months from now having 12 vaccines for which there's safety, efficacy, combined production capacity of 12 billion doses worldwide, and that is 70 to 90% effective, they would have said, no, not in the world I know. But what happened is we came together. We really, this is one part of coronavirus in which there was response, in which there was incredible coming together. But on the other side, exactly like AIDS, there was blame, there was distrust, there was misinformation, there was all sorts of things which really slowed down the response. So that I could go much deeper in either way, but in a nutshell, that's how the first pandemic of the last century in modern times and the first of this century has played out. The final thing is, unlike AIDS, we are on the cusp, or actually I would say like AIDS, but a different way. We're on the cusp of being able to end this pandemic. We have the tools. Lots we need to do in order to put those tools into practice to actually end it on the ground around the world.
Which is exactly what we're here to talk about today. Thank you for that. And Joya, so Partners in Health has been responding to epidemics for 30 years, AIDS in maybe at the very beginning, Ebola, cholera. So what have you learned from that, and what have you seen on the ground lately? How are you seeing the inequity play out in the countries that you're operating in for COVID, and how is it different from the other situations you've seen?
Yeah, so thank you so much, and thanks for having me on this panel. It's always a pleasure to be with Jono. We've worked together for a long time, and now I'm very excited to hear about Eric's work as well. What we've learned is that scarcity is really a myth. Scarcity is a created situation. And I think that is, a lot of, I hope what Eric will be talking to us about in terms of production. But when we started to treat AIDS in Haiti in 1998, it was just a charitable effort. We had donated unexpired drugs that we brought from patients in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and treated people in Haiti. But when we showed that we could do it and worked with activists and really a social movement of people saying, it's not just that we've got treatment in the North, as Jono said, since 96, 97, and there's no treatment in the global South. And in fact, it was really people living with AIDS in the global North who stood in solidarity with their brothers and sisters in countries from South Africa to Thailand to Uganda to Vietnam and said, we demand this treatment as a basic right. And what excuses we heard. And this is why, I really think what we need to question is the notion of scarcity. The excuses we heard is this is complicated technology. There is no way pharma can scale this up quick enough to meet the demand, and that in scaling this up or sharing patents, know-how, it will kill innovation. And none of these things turned out to be true. None, not one, right? Pharmaceutical, we went from having in about the year 2000, 50,000 or so people on antiretroviral therapy in sub-Saharan Africa. And today there are 27 million. And it was a huge lift, right? For countries, for communities, et cetera. It was this huge lift. But what happened was the know-how was not equitably shared. In fact, that India still hadn't signed on to the World Trade Organization treaty and started just mass producing generic versions of these drugs. As I know, Flo is working on, majority of the raw materials come from the global South anyway. So many of these drugs were developed with public monies in the United States and Europe. So there's every reason to think we ought to share these technologies. And so it wasn't too complicated, right? It wasn't too costly. The price now of antiretrovirals is $60 per person per year, and it was $10,000 in the early days. And then the other excuse that it would kill innovation, it did not. We see that this sort of massive scale did not cut into the profit margin of big pharma. And so I think we need to reflect on how do we use innovation in business in a way that will still protect the spirit of entrepreneurship, but that has a plan, an equity plan and a distribution plan. And I think, there have been some problems with the AstraZeneca rollout, but the AstraZeneca vaccine is a good example of that. It was intentionally shared with the Serum Institute in India. It was developed with public money from the UK. And so that is a model for saying it can be helpful in the North. It is the majority vaccine that's being given in Europe. But it also has a plan for production, and we need that. And I think what we learned from HIV is that there are ways to deal with the scarcity. It's just that we have to not accept that. So what we've done a lot of work with governments, and when we see the excellent response across the African continent, in large part, that early, very good response has been due and thanks to the systems that have been built in the years of implementing AIDS, TB, and malaria treatment under the Global Fund with the support of the World Health Organization. So global health for people like me and Jono and others has really, the AIDS fight has defined this era for us of not saying, well, let's just do what's feasible on the meager incomes of impoverished countries, but rather, how do we build systems that will work? And just the last thing I'll say is, in fighting Ebola in West Africa and Liberia and Sierra Leone, we made the conscious effort to not just focus on Ebola, just like we never just focused on HIV at Partners in Health. We helped the government to revitalize hospitals and clinics. And in both Liberia and Sierra Leone, we, as a part of decent 21st century medical care, we built oxygen plants. Right? You can't deliver modern medical care without oxygen. And lo and behold, the next pandemic is a respiratory one. So if you build systems to actually provide care, you're prepared for the next pandemic, right? You don't just, fight the last war. So I think there's a lot of work we can do together with the business community. But if we just reject the notion of scarcity and say, we need to make these available for all, how do we do it in a way that protects people's intellectual property, doesn't cut into whatever is needed for innovation, but still can deliver on equity? And it's never been more important than in COVID because it implicates the global economy.
So, Eric, your whole company, Flow, is about addressing that question of scarcity. I know that it came about in the beginning because of thinking about what was happening in other countries and then using those ideas back here in the US. Can you talk about what was scarce and what you're trying to do about it?
Yes, so just to tag into that HIV theme, starting with drugs for HIV, our co-founder at the Medicines for All Institute, he was approached by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the problem was there was a challenge with trying to make sure that we could drive down the cost of the active pharmaceutical ingredients for HIV medicines. Dr. Gupton, he had built the process for a drug called nevirapine, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation approached him and said, listen, if you can cut down the cost of this active ingredient by just 10%, and you can do it within a year, that's meaningful. That's meaningful for us. Well, he drove down the cost by more than 50% using novel technology. Flow chemistry is what it's called. So this is called continuous manufacturing technology, which allows for chemical reactions to develop a compound to occur on a much smaller scale. These chemical reactions occur until the entire volume is produced along a continuous flow reactor. And instead of what we've been doing for years and years, which is batch manufacturing, which uses these huge, large manufacturing facilities, it's very slow. It results in an enormous amount of toxic, hazardous waste, solvent that is utilized to make these reactions build on one another. Well, he had come up with a process to leverage advanced continuous manufacturing for these drugs in the developing world, HIV, TB, and malaria. I then got involved, and he said, okay, what could we do here domestically? And what are the challenges that we're dealing with here in the United States? And one of the biggest challenges that has been pervasive long before COVID-19 was challenges with drug shortages, and specifically drug shortages around key essential medicines. Now, an essential medicine is defined as a priority medicine that is needed by any country to sustain the health and well-being of that country. The World Health Organization has their own essential medicines list. The Food and Drug Administration recently in December put out their essential medicines list. So what Flow Corporation is doing as a public benefit corp is we have been blessed and fortunate to receive a contract in a public-private partnership with the United States government to work quickly to bring advanced manufacturing to the United States to support the development of these key active pharmaceutical ingredients to provide for domestic supply chain resiliency. COVID-19 exposed substantial supply chain challenges globally. And I think what each country is now having to do is ask themselves really tough questions around what should we have that is a part of a global supply chain? What should we have domestic supply chain resiliency in case something happens that can disrupt trade? Look no further than the Suez Canal challenge that just occurred. If something happens that can disrupt moving materials from one location to the next, it can greatly impact the health and well-being downstream of a population. Well, COVID-19 did that in a big way. And it did that for these key essential medicines because in the United States, 80% of our active pharmaceutical ingredients for these key essential medicines are made in foreign countries, primarily India and China. And in March of last year, India decided to shut down the exportation of 26 key active pharmaceutical ingredients, which obviously would cause a lot of panic around, okay, if they're going to cut down these 26, what's going to happen to these others? Hospitals were pulling out these essential medicines out of the channels, out of the wholesalers, and putting them into the hospital, and we're kind of protecting them, leaving challenges for availability of these medicines for others. And this was happening all throughout the world. You can imagine some of these active ingredients that are made for these essential medicines, and a lot of these are key injectable drugs that are used while in America, you all might remember, we were looking for ventilators, not just PPE. Well, some of these essential medicines are the drugs you need to intubate a patient to get them onto a ventilator. And every single country was looking for the same medicines. And so there were challenges in the supply chain. And some of these active ingredients were made in plants that had shut down to 10% capacity because they were in the middle of COVID containment zones. So these are the types of challenges that COVID-19 exacerbated. And what we're doing now at Flow is asking ourselves, okay, how do we create new advanced methods to drive down the cost so that we can have competitive manufacturing here in the United States? But then also, how do we, through our partnership with Medicines for All, who are working on the global side of things, how do we ensure equitable access to all of these active ingredients manufactured using these advanced processes that improve quality, decrease costs, have a lot more automation so that you can compete with lower labor, countries that have lower labor costs. So it's honestly, our vision is every human being should have access to the essential medicines necessary to sustain life and conquer disease. There really shouldn't even be a company that has that vision. Every human being in this world should make sure that they have equitable access to key, critical, essential generic medicines. And we're talking about drugs where if you call 911, these are the drugs in that drug box that are necessary to manage a cardiac arrest, as an example. And unfortunately today, even in America, you can't be guaranteed to have that medicine available. So we're trying to fix a broken supply chain, a supply chain that is ridden with complexities. We're trying to support a different way, reimagining the pricing and reimbursement of these medicines in the United States. We, as a public benefit corp, we believe there needs to be more price transparency in the system. And all of these things should be spoken about, not just domestically, but on a global scale.
I'd love to hear from either of you, Joya or Jono, about how you think about those supply chain questions and the issue of vaccine nationalism. So we've seen with the pandemic that in some senses it's underlining how global the supply chain and the distribution of these medicines has to be, but it's also showing that to be resilient, countries need to be able to handle these things locally in case the Suez Canal goes down again. So how should countries be making those assessments about balancing those two things?
Well, let's look for a minute at what the consequences, what the situation is and what the consequences are. The situation is that we are headed toward two realities. Where one reality is the rich country reality. By the end of 2021 or early 2022, immunized and trying in the ways that possible to get back to normal. The other reality is on the current trajectory, we're going to be lucky if we get even 20% of low and middle income populations immunized by the end of this year, and it'll take years at the current rate to get the entire population. I mean, this is unacceptable from a moral and a humanitarian point of view. It's a travesty, and it adds insult to injury because those are the most affected populations. But it's also self-defeating to let these two realities develop. Because number one, it's going to prolong the pandemic worldwide. Unvaccinated populations are the place where these new variants come out. The variants that we're seeing that are more contagious, more deadly, and or elude the vaccines, that's what's driving the surges that we've seen in Europe, that we're seeing now in India, and that we're seeing in several states here. And it's also changed the dynamic of COVID in the sense that it's spreading with the new variant as much in children. It's a new pandemic from that point of view. It will prolong the pandemic if we accept these two realities, and it'll delay recovery from an economic point of view. We need to unleash $9 trillion of pandemic recovery in order to be able to make up the deficits, the great inequities because of job losses, because of disrupted immunization programs, because of disrupted health services. So the current dynamic is really self-defeating. And yesterday, you mentioned at the beginning, the Rockefeller Foundation released a plan for financing global vaccine and recovery with resources that are already accessible for vaccines, $44 billion of funds that are already available or that can be released through the International Monetary Fund. And we just need to stand up and say, that's got to happen. That release of financial resources, $44 billion, will send a critical signal to the companies that have the potential to produce, to start to scale up. It will send a signal to heads of states and countries and all to really start working on the systems. In this country, the federal government did a nice job getting the vaccines there, but we just sort of we left it to the states individually, and it's taken a while for them to get the system going. And most now vaccines are being produced, coronavirus vaccines are being produced on every continent except Africa. And so the low and middle income countries are the producers, but what we need to do is take steps to see how we can expand production in the regions. Think about production in Africa. This won't be the last pandemic, and it may not be the last of COVID-19. We're going to need most likely boosters. So we need to simultaneously mobilize those funds, get the okay to go ahead with the plan that the Rockefeller Foundation released yesterday, and then really work hard to set up the systems. We could immunize the world by the end of 2022 by pulling out all the stops. And that would be the sort of achievement that we did with AIDS in the scale up of treatment. Many people are going to say it's impossible. It's not impossible. It's just difficult, but we could do it.
Let's talk about intellectual property.
Okay.
Oh, no, go ahead, Joya.
No, that's fine. Go ahead, Catherine.
So as you were saying, Joya, earlier, that intellectual property turned out to not be an issue as the pharmaceutical companies worried it would be when AIDS and HIV treatments were coming out, and that has been an argument that's been made, and several countries have been refusing to suspend their rules about intellectual property,
including the United States.
Including the United States, exactly. So I'd love to hear more about what's really happening there. Is it really a threat to innovation? If not, why not?
I mean, look, I think as long as there are mechanisms to have wealthy countries pay their fair share, or at least their share, there's room for profit. I mean, the United States is a very, very wealthy country that pays a lot of money for healthcare and is now offering the vaccine essentially free of cost to everyone. So we're paying for it. And the companies, Pfizer and Moderna, that have made the mRNA vaccine, which, we love the technology. It's amazing. I think science is incredible. But to me, the scientists that are involved in making it, they're not doing it for profit. They're doing it for intellectual curiosity. The people who are working in the factories, they're not doing it for profit. So we're talking about the profit motive of a very small number of people at the very top of these corporations. And so when we think of nationalism, nationalism in vaccines, right, can only be created by this false scarcity, right? If vaccines were widely available and at low cost, then it wouldn't matter how much the United States bought, right? And this, again, what we see with AIDS drugs is the US still, and health insurance companies pay a lot of money for AIDS drugs. And in the global South, they're free of charge to people, and mostly in the global North, free of charge at the point of care, covered by insurance, and they're being manufactured. But we need to really look at globalization in a different way, right? We have globalized the notion of profit. We unfortunately have global harm that's happening in things like climate change. We also need to think about what is the basic set of human rights that ought to be globalized. And certainly health is one of those foundational things. And it can't just be left up to, okay, this country, Mozambique or Chad or whatever, they don't have the money, therefore they don't have the right to health. And whether we're all protected, none of us are protected if we're all protected. I'm not sure I totally buy it, but I buy it enough to say that we have to believe we're an interconnected world. And I'd love to see companies, and again, like the AstraZeneca model, build in equity in their business plan from Jump Street, right? To say who's going to pay for it, who's not going to pay for it, how are we going to help expand these access to a generic version? Because somebody asked in the chat about, why isn't the WHO talking to private companies? They are, but they're not forthcoming. And then the United States has their back. And frankly, I don't think the United States trade representative, if they are representing the United States, should have the back of Big Pharma. I think they should have the back of the American people who need to get out of this global pandemic, right? And one of the ways to do that would be sharing knowledge, patents, and know-how.
Joya, there's a reason that in 2019 in a Gallup poll that assessed all of the perceptions of the various industries in the United States, that the pharmaceutical industry ranked last in public perception. And they actually just moved up in 2020. They went from last to second to last, only behind the federal government. And so I think one of the things that we should also be thinking about here are what are different business models that will allow for these types of drugs. I mean, the opposite side of the coin is in the market that we're in, which is the essential generic medicines. Mm-hmm. These vials of medicines that some of the ones that we're making, they're not only not profitable, you lose profit on them. In fact, a bottle of water at an airport costs more than one vial of these key critical essential medicines necessary to sustain life. So you can have the pendulum swing so far that you actually end up creating issues where pharmaceutical manufacturers don't want to make the drug anymore because it's not sustainable. Then it results in drug shortages.
Yes.
And what I would say is you got to find a business model in the middle. And one of those things to drive forward with in thinking about this is bringing transparency back into the center of the discussion. And specifically, an explicit example would be sometimes the hospital or the customer or the government just wants to know, how much does it cost for you to make this medicine? And what's your overhead? And then let's just put a small profit that you negotiate, and there's transparency in a cost plus pricing structure. We know then you're able to survive and sustain yourself, but that level of transparency, it does not exist in the majority of the pharmaceutical world. People don't know how much drugs really cost. We throw out numbers like, oh, we have to recoup our R&D because it costs on average $1.3 billion. But in many cases, that's not the case. So I think opening up the conversation of, on the other side of this pandemic, what should global health and access to all medicines, whether they're vaccines or essential medicines, look like through new unique business models to help restore trust and confidence into our pharmaceutical supply chains?
That's such a great point, Eric. And I know that in Brazil, which was one of the first countries to make their own manufacture their own antiretroviral therapy, and was threatened with sanctions and economic pain from the US, but they did it out of the notion of national sovereignty and the fact that they had in their constitution the right to health. One of their key targets for improving and rolling out their national health system was pricing transparency. And they would just post stuff on their website so that everyone can see. And, you know, the US has laws on the books about our ability to negotiate as a government for prices, especially if drugs are developed with US public monies, which most of them are, especially the new developments. But we don't use it because there's so much pharma money and lobbying. So when we have something like the World Trade Organization, the trade representative is representing businesses instead of the American people.
Yeah, no, that's well said. I'll finally just end with this example. We just launched a children's hospital coalition. It's over 10 of the most distinguished children's hospitals in the country came to us, and they said, we have uncertainty. We have uncertainty in whether these medicines are going to be available for our children. We have uncertainty in the quality. We have uncertainty in pricing. If you just bring us certainty that these drugs are going to be available and you guarantee the pricing, and you share with us what that looks like, we will enter into long-term take or pay supply agreements. So we'll bring you certainty in supply and orders if you bring us certainty in the supply and availability. So it's an interesting model, and we do cost plus pricing. And the same thing we did with the United States government for these drugs. We tell them how much it's going to cost. We have a single-digit fee that we charge, and if you can bring that transparency and new business models and meet the customer where they are and understand what their needs are, there is a way to ensure equity in the distribution of these key essential medicines. And I think the same thing can apply towards innovator molecules such as these vaccines.
So what are the most urgent changes that need to happen either within pharmaceutical companies or in the form of pressure from governments on them that would change the way business as usual is done and affect both COVID drugs and other drugs that are so difficult to afford, like insulin, for example?
Well, I think if looking at it from just the perspective of COVID and pandemics, I think we need to establish an expectation and really push on companies to really follow this what I would call co-optation model, a combination of cooperation and competition. And we saw that when Merck went out of their vaccine didn't go well, J&J's went well, but they didn't have the production capacity. I don't know what happened behind closed doors in Washington, but the result is that there's cooperation and we're getting vaccine. The AstraZeneca model is a great model. And I think the expectation that in the context of a pandemic, that companies that do have the technology will not just kind of release their IP and say, go to it, but actually do a low cost or no cost license combined with technical, with transfer of technology to produce it. So we are getting products that really are done with the know-how. And that's really critical in vaccines, because we do have the capacity there. So I think that needs to be an expectation. There's maybe some incentives that can be built into doing that. But I think there's a access to medicines index that rates companies on how publicly spirited they are. The other thing is there are 300,000 or 400,000 people worldwide who volunteered to be in these clinical trials. It's the social contract there. It's a human rights issue. It's a social contract that says, I'm risking, in a sense, risking my health for the benefit of humanity. And I think it's a violation of the social contract that gave the companies the data to prove the effectiveness of vaccine, not to find ways of sharing that benefit more widely. And they can do it, and they can do it without losing the high margin, the northern market. But it'll be in everybody's interest to set that expectation for pandemics and for other critical areas of drug development.
So I'd like to switch to some questions from the audience. We have some really great questions. And first, let's see. Jackie asks, some argue that Western countries were rightly prioritized in vaccine rollouts because they've experienced the greatest number of deaths globally. What's your response to that argument? That's for any of you.
I did answer that online, but I'll answer again. I think that's just an excuse. It's a post hoc excuse, because quite the opposite is what we saw with HIV. Quite the opposite is what we see for tuberculosis, cholera, any other disease that the impoverished nations are disproportionately affected. And then we're told, well, it's too big of a problem and they don't have the resources, right? So if the situation was reversed and COVID was, devastating Africa and the United States had been relatively spared, we still would be getting the majority of vaccines. So I don't think it's ever been based on epidemiology as far as I can see.
Yeah.
Julia, can I ask you a question I've always wondered, and maybe John, you can weigh in on this one as well. Isn't it also possible that there's a data disparity from an epidemiological perspective in some of these developing countries where, early on, we didn't really know how widespread COVID-19 was in these countries, and the reporting systems weren't as developed. Mm-hmm. And now we're starting to see a catch up in countries like Brazil and in India, and they are, starting to rise in the level of deaths. And I just want your perspective on that as well.
Well,
go ahead, John.
Two things on that. One, on that part, the lack of testing and surveillance and all, that's a part of it. But one of the defining features of COVID has been its ability to overrun emergency rooms and hospitals and all. And so we haven't seen that so in the same way, and that's hard to miss. But that, to me, that's not the real issue. Is we've got to get everybody covered now, and on that one, like most things pandemic, it's not either or. It's a false choice to say it's either immunize the North first or immunize everybody. No, we have the tools and the resources to do both. And I think that's the real thing. We have those resources. The report we launched yesterday makes it really clear. If the world's leaders decide to, they can release the resources, and we can move ahead And it's in all of our interest to move ahead now to scale up with the tools that we have in hand.
Yeah, I would just also add to that, Eric, that in my experience in reviewing a lot of country data with my colleagues in Rwanda, in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Malawi, Lesotho, there are two things. I mean, in many cases, the data is pretty good. The data in Vietnam is excellent. If you really want to look at a country that's done incredibly well as Vietnam, and you can tell by the positivity rate of the tests. They're running positivity rates in the 1% level. They've had, I think, 134 deaths in a giant country. So we know that's real. In Rwanda, similarly, early on, they were running very low positivity rate, and they had planned so far in advance that they had plenty of PCR kits in the country. So I think what we see is that some of the success is certainly real and is built on the back of the 20 years of global health investments from the fight against AIDS, TB, and malaria. I think what's much worse, however, is the ability to treat severe disease, because there are countries that don't even make oxygen. There are countries that don't have a ventilator. So, and as Jono says, you're not going to miss it if people are suddenly falling dead from a respiratory illness, as they are in a middle-income country like Peru, because they've run out of oxygen. So I think there are places we know the data is okay, and we know the successes of prevention are real, but we're not out of the woods, and we're seeing these second and third waves. So I think, we should believe the data, particularly by triangulating the prevalence rate or incidence rate with the positivity rate of tests.
Yeah, and that's why, Catherine, this discussion is so critical, because we've got to prevent what could happen if we don't get these vaccines and key essential medicines into the hospitals, and start honestly operationalizing a plan now for that. We're already behind. So.
Yeah, right. And that's the key thing. I mean, I remember vividly when WHO and the UN had negotiated low prices for antiretrovirals for AIDS medicines. And the day before the World Health Assembly, we had an emergency meeting with the African Ministers of Health, because we hadn't prepared them for the fact that their countries were going to be looking for them to provide these medicines. So we can't do that to low and middle income countries around the world by saying, here are the vaccines, go figure it out. We really have to help get those systems and provide, a lot of it is south to south cooperation. Countries like Rwanda and Vietnam and Peru, well, okay.
Not Peru.
Yeah, but that's going to be so critical, because this will be the biggest vaccination program in human history. People are being asked to do something they have never done before. The first thing that goes on in someone's mind is why we can't do it here. As soon as you get them in conversation with people who've already done it, they've figured it out. And one thing that's really clear is the problems are relatively common, but different countries are good at solving different problems. And so we've got to think, how do we scale up the biggest effort in history? And that's going to be cross-learning. It's going to be getting ahead of it, not waiting for the vaccines to be at the port. So there's a lot of work to be done, but it's not a matter of money. It's a matter of commitment to release that money, send the signal to everyone. We're up and going. We're going to immunize the planet together, because it's the best way forward for all of us.
I have a question from Sinead. The pandemic has provided new metrics as to which lives have value. For example, the UK's frailty score for disabled and chronically ill people. How do you envision this experience might shape the future of health?
I mean, I don't think it's new. It's sad. We shouldn't value lives over other lives. But there is a long tradition of doing that. It's often motivated by the country you were born, or your race, or your citizenship status. And hopefully, and one of the things that at Partners in Health we're really fighting for with allies around the world is the notion of a people's vaccine, that everyone has the right to a vaccine, to normalize and equalize the value of human rights and human life. But I think it's only that this dire situation in places like the UK and the US is, waking some people up to this. But for people in communities of color, for people in the disabled community, indigenous communities, they've already understood this metric.
I'll just add from my perspective, when I started getting into this and we started looking at alternative business models and looking at a public benefit court model, we partnered with a company called Civica. Civica in the United States is now the largest nonprofit pharmaceutical company. And that's a misnomer, but it shouldn't be. We shouldn't have only a handful of nonprofit pharmaceutical companies in this world, yet we do. And I think that we need to look at medicines a little bit differently. In our world, a lot of these essential medicines have been viewed as commodities for years instead of strategic assets for a country. And I think we need to start thinking about what are new models that allow these to be strategic assets. And if you have the right business models, especially nonprofit or public benefit, that are mission-driven organizations, I think that will help ensure equitable access for multiple populations. The fact that we had to, it's funny, my daughter came up to me and said, "Daddy, what kind of medicines are you making?" She's 10 years old. And I said, "Sweetheart, we're making the medicines that no one else would make for the populations that no one else would serve." And that just shouldn't be the case. So I think we have to look differently about what are the areas that you can bring meaning into your life and find significance versus just success. And this is one area that is wide open for opportunities if people just started thinking, hey, maybe I want to move out of going back to Joya, your comment on the people who are making the vaccine, the technical, the scientific people who might say, I think I'd like to work in a nonprofit and I want to take that element out of it. I just want to work on things that are significant. There's a huge opportunity there for the future. And I think this pandemic might open up and catalyze more of these business models.
Okay, this may be the last question we have time for. We'll see. It's from Mohammed. In rolling out vaccines globally, how do we combat the growing sense of distrust fostered by the pandemic, not only between countries, but within them?
Well, a couple things on that. I think that trustworthiness before trust. So we've got to demonstrate that we're going to keep our promises. The other thing is that what we realized and keep learning again, we learned it in Ebola, is that the messenger matters as much as the message. So what we're doing in this country with vaccine acceptance and trying to get it, particularly in the Black colored indigenous populations, is actually find trusted leaders from those communities to be the spokespeople. It's got to be a multi-part thing. We also need to be really consistent about the communication. Say what we know, what we don't know yet. So, for example, we do know that the vaccine will prevent serious illness and death. What we don't know yet, but are still learning, and it's all promising, is how it will work with children and how it will work in pregnancy. So we're being honest about that. We have no reason to believe that these vaccines are a problem in pregnancy, but it's that candor. It's getting role models. There've been great efforts by leaders at the community level and the national level to get vaccinated. And as we go forward, the more people who benefit and share the fact of that fact is important. The other thing is the coincidence. Really be careful about the coincidence, because when you're I mean, you know, for every 100,000 people who get immunized today, X will die a week from now from a heart attack. For every 100,000 who don't get immunized today, the same X will die of a heart attack. So we need to be really careful in thinking about the risks of vaccine and mobilizing allies at all levels.
Yeah, I just want to say that I don't think the idea of vaccine hesitancy, I mean, the anti-vax movement in the United States is something completely other, but just in general, vaccine hesitancy, stigma, these things are not fixed in stone. And we've seen this with any infectious disease. You know, in the beginning, before there was good Ebola treatment, people who had Ebola were going in hiding because they didn't want to be thrown into a disgusting holding center, right? I think as more and more people see that the vaccine is well tolerated, that it allows people to have more freedoms, that there will be less hesitancy, you know, as a neighbor down the street gets it. So, you know, the idea of hesitancy, and these are, you know, people want to almost hold on to that is as if it's a binary issue, like fact or fiction, but it's not. It really is a process of trustworthiness, as John has said, but also of experience that, you know, people have in the pandemic, and you know, people who can be leaders in their communities, and really show that it's a helpful thing.
Are you concerned at all about what's been happening with the news about the very rare side effects with the AstraZeneca vaccine, especially because that's one that has been going and needs to go to so many low and middle income countries?
I mean, I'll tell you from a physician perspective and a pharmaceutical scientist who develops medicines perspective, it connects with the last question, which is I think individuals just want scientifically accurate and credible information. And that needs to be clearly communicated from the right sources. And I think that, you know, it's very easy for that to get mixed up. And so what I'm hoping will come out of this is kind of bringing that scientific credibility back, just being open and honest with individuals of here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's the efficacy data we have, here's the real world data we have, here's the safety data we have. Put all of that together, have it on a single website from different sources where you can go as deep as you want to go, but then eventually allow individuals to make informed decisions and allow them a vehicle to ask questions and get credible answers. And right now, there's kind of disparate sources of information, and some people just don't know where to go to get answers. They want to call their local physician, but even their local physician doesn't have the right information. And so I think my answer to you is, of course, any adverse event is it's concerning, but you have to weigh it on the totality of the evidence as presented, and you need to make sure that it's understood. What does that mean? So what is the incidence, or how often does that occur in a population? And then comparisons help. What does that look like compared to other common vaccines that the same individual may be getting every single year, such as the flu vaccine? And when you start looking at comparisons, you start saying, oh, okay, well, this maybe isn't as concerning as we thought.
There's a role for the media there as well. So we are out of time, sadly. And as predicted, I'm frustrated because I wish we could keep this conversation going for a lot longer. But thank you all for joining us, especially to our panelists. This was a great discussion, and I really appreciate your time today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kevin.